Danny Kahneman makes the distinction between System 1 and System 2. And I think it's worth spelling out a little bit exactly kind of the character of those two systems. So System 1 is, as I said, it's fast, it's automatic, and it's completely effortless. You don't even know you're doing it. And so a few of those examples include, for example, you might see a face, an angry face. And so if you look at a photo and you see the angry face, then you don't have to kind of build it up. You don't have to recognize, oh, well, snarling face, kind of frowny wrinkles on the forehead, showing teeth, right? None of these things have to happen in order for you to recognize that it's an angry face. It just happens. Another example is 2 plus 2 equals, right? You don't even, 4 just pops into your head, or bread and butter, hopefully, pops into your head. And again, I mean, so kind of the nature of this processing means that it just happens to you. Another example that we revisited in episode 2 was this idea of illusions. And again, you can't help but to see these illusions. We gave the example of the faces appearing on the side of the screen. You can't help but to see the faces appear alien-like. This is a really nice example. It's by Edward Adelson, and it's called the checker shadow illusion. And you see 2 squares marked A and B. And when you're looking at the squares, you can't help but to see one square being darker than the other, right? They look like they're completely different, but in fact, they're exactly the same shade of gray. So if you were to actually measure, and we encourage people to kind of do some arts and crafts here, and you can see, in fact, that the 2 squares are, in fact, identical, but you can't help but to see them as completely different, right? So this is System 1. So you can't help. These things actually happen to you. You're not doing anything to see these illusions. And I think that's really worth pointing out. And as we talked about in episode 2, people have this conception when it comes to higher order properties like learning and memory that we have some sort of introspective access, that we have some control over these sorts of things. But in fact, as Nisbet said, we actually don't. So that's kind of System 1. These are the things that happen to you. It's effortless, it's automatic. But System 2 is the opposite. And so instead of 2 plus 2, we have something like, I don't know, 17 times 24. Yeah, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, right? Like 2 plus 2 does. So you could compute it, you could sit down, you could probably even do it in your head if you had a bit of time, but it doesn't immediately jump out at you. And another one might be, so a System 1 property might be recognizing a familiar face. So you can recognize your friend immediately, and you can recognize someone that your mother, for example, in a crowd even, she would just kind of pop out. But when you're searching for a friend, for example, in a crowded auditorium, right, and you're trying to find out who it is, it's the serial process. You have to do one thing, no, not them, and you kind of go through this type of long, effortful process in order to spot that person. So that's kind of the distinction between System 1 and 2. Another one, which I find quite interesting, is driving. And so I've been living in Australia for the last 10 years or so. I have absolutely no problem driving on the left side of the road. It's completely effortless. It's largely System 1, particularly on an open road. There's no processing whatsoever. You can almost forget how much you've actually traveled. But when I go back to Canada, where I grew up, and drive on the other side of the road, it is really effortful. I have to sit and okay, drive on the right, drive on the right, indicators on this side, not the window wipers go off every once in a while, and it's not easy.
This freaks me out, actually. So we recently went to New York to have a chat with Danny Kahneman, and of course, you're driving on the right side of the road, and I'm in the passenger seat. And we're driving through the streets of New York, which is hard at the best of times. But then you're talking to me about quite complicated, scientific processes and principles, and I can tell that your mind is not necessarily on the road, but it's thinking about these things. That's another facet of System 2 kind of thinking, actually. So the System 2 is slow and deliberate, but the resources are limited. So when you're trying to do 2 complex tasks, which is driving on the other side of the road that you're used to and explain a complex phenomenon to me, those 2 interfere with each other. So I think next time we're in the US, you should keep focused on the road, but maybe we're in Australia when system one is taking control of the wheel, then we could have a chat about more complicated things.
And you'd like to think that we'd be immune to these sorts of effects. And we talked about this previously, I think in episode 2, where we aren't any better than anyone else at making these sorts of errors, right? So hopefully I had somebody, in the seat next to me that would say either shut up or pull over and we can carry on the discussion. But hopefully, this distinction between system 1 and 2 I think is quite important. Now everybody should have completed the 3 questions that we had earlier in the episode. Now these are part of something called the cognitive reflection task. Do you want to tell us a bit about the test?
Sure, it was developed by a researcher at Yale called Shane Frederick, and it's kind of like a 3-question IQ test, but it's a little bit different. It assesses your ability to suppress the kind of quick system 1 response and your ability to rely on the slower, deliberate system 2 response. So here's an example. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does a ball cost? Now, when I first heard this example, my internal monologue was just screaming, 10 cents, 10 cents, 10 cents. But hold on a minute, if the ball costs 10 cents and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, that means the bat costs $1.10 and the ball costs 10 cents, which adds up to $1.20, which doesn't make sense, right? It has to add to $1.10. So if you spend a little bit of time thinking about this, you realize that the bat has to cost $1.05 and the ball 5 cents. That's the only way that these two things can add up to $1.10. So as I said, you've got to, in order to get this question right, you've got to really suppress that initial response and think a little bit more about it.
And so it's the same thing with the other 2 questions on the cognitive reflection test. So I think the second one is if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long does it take for 100 machines to create 100 widgets? And immediately the intuitive sort of response is 100 minutes, right? But in fact, that's not correct. The third question is a question about lily pads on a lake that keep doubling in size each day. And if it covers the entire lake after 48 days, how long does it take to cover half of the lake? The first thing that comes to your mind is half of 48, which is 24, which also isn't correct. So it would be great if people could kind of go back to those questions and use their system 2 and figure out exactly what the correct response is to these questions. But yeah, it's not easy, and it takes a little bit of cognitive effort to stop and kind of move on. But I hope people don't feel bad if they didn't get each of the 3 questions correct. In fact, that's extremely rare, as Shane Frederick showed. In fact, they compared people across a whole bunch of institutions from Harvard and MIT and other institutions that aren't in part of the Ivy League and so on. And a lot of people didn't get it correct. So they shouldn't feel bad if they didn't get all 3 correct, but it does seem to measure people's degree of rationality, if you call it. I think Keith Stanovich from Toronto talks about this difference between intelligence and rationality. And rationality is kind of what we mean by system 2 processing, the extent to which people put in the effort to process the information a bit more carefully. But I think it's worth keeping in mind, again, the point of this exercise is to recognize the distinction between system 1 and system 2. And obviously, the grandfather of heuristics and biases and the originator of this distinction between system 1 and 2 is Daniel Kahneman. Now, we had a conversation with Danny in New York, and he really made that distinction between the 2 systems.